The dust devils swirled through the empty streets of Skidoo, California, as Victoria Ann pressed her palm against the rough wooden wall of the general store, trying to steady herself while black spots danced across her vision, and her stomach twisted with a gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion over the past 3 days. She had not eaten since leaving her aunt's homestead, 40 miles south, and the journey on foot through the unforgiving Mojave Desert terrain had drained what little strength remained in her 22-year-old body. The year was 1878, and Skidoo was a mining town carved from the harsh landscape, filled with prospectors chasing gold and silver veins through the Panamint Mountains. Victoria had come here with hope burning in her chest, carrying a letter from a merchant who had promised her work as a seamstress, only to discover upon arrival that the man had been killed in a mining accident 2 weeks prior. His shop stood empty and padlocked, and with it died her dreams of steady employment and a fresh start away from the suffocating grief of her family's farm where both parents had succumbed to fever the previous winter. The general store's door stood propped open to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the August heat, and Victoria took a tentative step toward the entrance. Perhaps the proprietor would extend credit if she explained her situation, or maybe someone inside would know of work available for a woman with skills in sewing, cooking, and keeping accounts. Her worn calico dress hung loosely on her frame, testament to the weight she had lost during months of hardship, and her dark brown hair, though neatly pinned, showed the dust of her long walk into town. Inside the store, the air was marginally cooler and smelled of leather, tobacco, coffee beans, and the sharp tang of pickled goods. Shelves lined every wall, stocked with canned foods, bolts of fabric, mining equipment, ammunition, and sundries. 3 men stood near the counter engaged in conversation with the shopkeeper, their voices a low rumble about ore yields and water rights. Victoria moved slowly along the nearest aisle, her eyes drawn helplessly to the food items. Jars of preserves glinted like jewels in the dim light filtering through dusty windows. Sacks of flour and cornmeal sat stacked in neat rows. Her mouth watered at the sight of dried apples, and her hand reached out almost of its own accord to touch the barrel of hardtack crackers. The room began to tilt sideways. Victoria gripped the shelf edge, her knuckles white with the effort of keeping herself upright. The voices around her seemed to fade and echo as if coming from a great distance. She tried to call out to ask for help, but her tongue felt thick and useless in her dry mouth. The black spots multiplied and merged, swallowing the light, and then the floor rushed up to meet her as her legs buckled beneath her weight. The sound of her collapse brought instant attention. The conversation at the counter ceased abruptly, and heavy boots thundered across the wooden floorboards. Victoria was aware of hands catching her before she struck the ground completely, strong arms easing her down with surprising gentleness. She heard urgent voices, felt herself being shifted, and then something cool pressed against her forehead. Miss, can you hear me?" The voice was deep, concerned, and close to her ear. Victoria forced her eyes open and found herself staring up into a weathered face framed by dark hair that touched the collar of a dusty shirt. The man was perhaps 27 or 28, with gray eyes that studied her with intense focus, and a sun-bronzed complexion that spoke of long days working outdoors. A bandana hung around his neck, and she could see the outline of a holster at his hip. "I am sorry," Victoria managed to whisper, shame flooding through her. "I did not mean to cause a disturbance." "How long since you have eaten?" the cowboy asked, his tone brooking no evasion. His large hand still supported her shoulders, preventing her from trying to rise too quickly. Victoria swallowed hard. 3 days. I walked from the southern settlements. I came for a position that no longer exists." The cowboy's jaw tightened and something flickered in those gray eyes, anger perhaps, but not directed at her. He looked up at the other men who had gathered around. "Get me some water and some of that bread from the bakery next door. Now." One of the men hurried off while another helped the cowboy shift Victoria into a sitting position, her back against the counter. The shopkeeper, a portly man with spectacles and thinning hair, looked down at her with a mixture of concern and wariness that suggested he had seen too many desperate people pass through his establishment. "I cannot pay you," Victoria said quickly, looking at the cowboy who seemed to have taken charge of the situation. "Not immediately. But if you know of any work, I am capable and willing. I can sew, cook, keep books, tend animals. I will repay any kindness shown to me, I give you my word." The cowboy studied her face for a long moment, and Victoria found she could not look away from his gaze. There was something solid about him, reliable like bedrock beneath shifting sand. "What is your name?" he asked. "Victoria Ann. I came from a homestead south of here. My parents passed. My aunt could not support another mouth, and I heard there might be work in the mining towns." "I am Robert Xavier," the cowboy said. "Most folks call me Rob. I work a cattle operation about 10 miles from here, supplying beef to the mining camps and settlements." He paused as the man returned with a tin cup of water and a cloth-wrapped bundle. Robert took the water and held it carefully to Victoria's lips. "Slow sips. Not too much at once or you will be sick." The water was the most glorious thing Victoria had ever tasted, cool and clean, soothing her parched throat. She wanted to gulp it down but obeyed Robert's instruction, taking small measured drinks while he watched to ensure she did not overdo it. When the cup was half empty, he set it aside and unwrapped the bundle to reveal a thick slice of bread with butter melting into its surface. "Small bites," Robert instructed, breaking off a piece and handing it to her. "Let your stomach adjust." Victoria took the bread with trembling fingers and bit into it, fighting the urge to cram the entire slice into her mouth. The taste of it, simple wheat and butter, nearly brought tears to her eyes. She chewed slowly, aware of Robert's watchful presence and the curious stares of the other men in the store. Humiliation warred with gratitude in her chest, but the gnawing hunger overrode her pride. "You got family here in Skidoo?" Robert asked as she finished the first small piece and he handed her another. Victoria shook her head. "No one. I came on the promise of work that did not materialize. I have a small amount of money, enough perhaps for a few days' room and board if I am careful, but I need to find employment quickly." Robert was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. The other men had begun to drift back to their own business, though the shopkeeper remained nearby, listening openly to the conversation. Victoria noticed that Robert commanded a certain respect in the store. Something in the way the others deferred to him suggested he was known and well regarded in the community. "Can you really cook?" Robert asked finally. "Not just beans and bacon, but proper meals for working men." "Yes," Victoria said firmly, sitting up straighter despite her weakness. "My mother taught me everything she knew. I can make bread, pies, stews, roasts, preserves. I managed our household from the age of 16 when she fell ill." Robert nodded slowly, seeming to come to some decision. He stood in one fluid motion and turned to the shopkeeper. "Martin, I need supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beef, beans, rice, canned goods, whatever a household would need for about 2 weeks. Also some fabric, needles, thread, and whatever else a woman requires for decent living." Martin the shopkeeper blinked behind his spectacles. "That is quite a list, Rob. You starting a boarding house?" "Just fill the order," Robert said, pulling out a worn leather wallet, "and be generous with the portions." Victoria struggled to her feet, using the counter for support. "Wait, please. I cannot accept charity. I do not even know you." Robert turned back to her, and something in his expression had softened. "It is not charity, Miss Anne. I am making you a business proposition. My cattle operation has grown considerably over the past year. I have 5 men working for me now, and we are all living in bunkhouses and eating whatever we can throw together after a long day's work. The men are starting to grumble about the food situation, and I cannot say I blame them. If you can cook the way you claim, I will offer you room and board plus a wage of $15 a month to keep house and prepare meals for the crew." Victoria stared at him, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Room and board. You have proper accommodations." "There is a small house on the property, originally built for the previous owner's mother. It has been empty for 2 years, needs some cleaning and fixing up, but it has 4 walls, a roof that does not leak, a good stove, and a door that locks from the inside." Robert met her eyes steadily. "You would have privacy and safety. The men live in the bunkhouses on the other side of the main barn. I would make it clear that you are an employee under my protection, and any man who showed you disrespect would answer to me." The offer was almost too good to be true, and Victoria found herself searching Robert's face for signs of deception or ulterior motives. But his expression remained open and earnest, and something in her gut told her this was a genuine opportunity. Still, caution made her ask, "Why would you make such an offer to a complete stranger? You know nothing about me beyond my name and my current unfortunate circumstances." Robert glanced down at his boots, then back up at her. "My mother raised 4 sons on her own after my father was killed in the war. There were times when we had nothing, times when we relied on the kindness of strangers to get by. She always told us that when we had the means to help someone in genuine need, we should do it without hesitation, because someday we might be the ones needing help again." He shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable with the admission. "Beyond that, I genuinely do need someone who can cook and keep house. My men are good workers but terrible cooks, and I am not much better. It is a legitimate position that needs filling." Victoria felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension that had been there so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. "Then, I accept your offer, Mr. Xavier, and I promise you will not regret giving me this chance." "Rob," he corrected with a slight smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer. "If we are going to be working together, we should dispense with the formalities." He turned back to the shopkeeper. "Martin, add some decent boots to that order, size appropriate for Miss Anne here. And a proper coat, a hat, and work gloves." "Really, that is too much," Victoria protested, but Robert held up a hand. "You cannot cook or work a ranch house in worn-out shoes, and the nights get cold even in summer once you get out of town. Consider it equipment necessary for the job." He pulled out several bills and laid them on the counter. "Start gathering those supplies, Martin. I want to get back to the ranch before nightfall." As the shopkeeper began pulling items from shelves and calling out to his assistant to help, Robert guided Victoria to a chair near the counter. "Sit and rest while I get everything sorted. Finish that bread, and there is more water if you need it." Victoria sank into the chair, her legs still trembling from the combination of hunger, weakness, and overwhelming relief. She watched Robert move around the store with Martin, pointing out items and making decisions about quantities. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, and she noticed how other customers who entered the store greeted him respectfully. One older man clapped him on the shoulder and engaged in brief conversation about cattle prices, and a younger prospector asked his advice about purchasing a horse. While Robert was occupied, Victoria allowed herself to study him more carefully. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of someone who worked hard physically every day. His clothes were practical, well-worn denim trousers, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, sturdy boots, and a gun belt that looked like it had seen considerable use. There was no flash or pretense about him, nothing of the dandy or the braggart that she had encountered among some of the men in town during her brief time there. He seemed solid, dependable, exactly the kind of man her father had been before illness took him. The pile of supplies on the counter grew steadily. Sacks of flour and sugar, tins of coffee and tea, dried beans and rice, salt pork and beef, canned peaches and tomatoes, a ham wrapped in cloth, eggs packed in sawdust, butter in a crock, fresh vegetables that had come in on the morning freight wagon. Martin added the fabric Robert had requested, sturdy cotton prints suitable for work dresses, along with thread, needles, buttons, and a few other sewing notions. A pair of well-made leather boots appeared, along with a wool coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and gloves. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes as she watched the transformation of Robert's money into tangible security. Even if the arrangement lasted only a few weeks, these supplies represented food in her belly, clothes on her back, and a chance to prove her worth. She would work harder than any employee Robert Xavier had ever had. She would make herself indispensable. "All right, that should do it," Robert said finally, surveying the loaded counter with satisfaction. "Martin, can you have your boy help me load this into the wagon? I am parked just outside." "Of course, Rob." Martin gestured to a gangly youth who had been stocking shelves in the back. "Tommy, help Mr. Xavier with these supplies." Robert came back to where Victoria sat and offered his hand to help her up. "Think you can manage a wagon ride?" "It is about 10 miles to the ranch, mostly flat but a few rough patches." Victoria stood, grateful to find her legs more steady now that she had food and water in her system. "I can manage, and thank you truly. I will not let you down." "I believe that," Robert said simply, and something in the way he looked at her made her heart skip strangely in her chest. They moved outside into the glaring afternoon sun. The heat hit Victoria like a physical force after the relative cool of the store, but she raised her chin and followed Robert to where a sturdy wagon stood hitched to 2 bay horses. The wagon bed was already partially filled with supplies he must have purchased earlier, ranch equipment and tools from the look of it. Robert and Tommy worked efficiently to load the new purchases, arranging everything to prevent shifting during the journey. Victoria wanted to help but recognized she would probably be more hindrance than assistance in her current state, so she stood in the shade of the store's awning and watched the activity on the street. Skidoo was larger than she had expected, a genuine town rather than just a rough mining camp. Besides the general store, she could see a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, a livery stable, a small restaurant, and several other businesses. Men moved purposefully along the wooden sidewalks, and a few women in practical dresses similar to her own hurried about their errands. A freight wagon rumbled past, heading toward the mines that scarred the mountains above town. The whole place hummed with the energy of commerce and industry, people chasing fortune in an unforgiving land. "Ready," Robert called, securing the last of the supplies under a canvas tarp. He came around to the side of the wagon and offered Victoria his hand to help her up onto the bench seat. She took his hand, noticing the calluses that spoke of rope work and hard labor, and climbed up to settle on the sun-warmed wood. Robert swung up beside her with easy grace and took up the reins. With a click of his tongue and a gentle slap of leather, the horses moved forward, pulling the laden wagon into the street. They passed through Skidoo at a steady pace, and Victoria took in the details of the town that might become her nearest connection to civilization. Robert pointed out a few landmarks as they went: the doctor's office, the telegraph station, the church that served multiple denominations, and where a traveling preacher held services once a month. "We make a supply run about every 2 weeks," Robert explained as they left the last buildings behind and headed south on a dusty track that served as the main road. "Sometimes more often if we need something specific. You will be welcome to come along whenever you like, though I warn you the trip is not particularly exciting. After walking 40 miles alone, any trip in a wagon will seem luxurious," Victoria said with feeling. The bench seat was hard and the wagon bounced over every rut and rock, but compared to trudging through the desert on foot, it felt marvelously easy. Robert glanced at her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You walked 40 miles alone. That is either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," Victoria admitted. "But I had little choice. My aunt could barely feed her own children after the drought killed most of the crops. I was one more mouth they could not afford. When I received the letter about the seamstress position, it seemed like Providence offering a solution. I did not learn until I arrived that Mr. Henderson had died." "Henderson was a decent man," Robert said. "That cave-in at the Lucky Dollar Mine killed 3 men. The town took up a collection for the widows. They fell into silence for a while as the wagon rolled across the landscape. The terrain was harsh and beautiful in its own way, scrubland dotted with Joshua trees and creosote bushes, mountains rising stark against the brilliant blue sky, the air so clear and dry that distances became deceptive. Victoria found herself relaxing slightly as the rocking motion of the wagon and the warmth of the sun combined with her full stomach to create a drowsy contentment. She had to fight to keep her eyes open. "You can sleep if you need to," Robert said, noticing her struggle. "I will make sure you do not fall off." Victoria wanted to protest that she was fine, but another yawn betrayed her. "I have not slept well in quite some time," she admitted. "I was afraid to sleep too deeply on the road, and last night in town I could only afford a spot in a boarding house room shared with 5 other women. It was not conducive to rest." "Well, you will have your own room at the ranch with a door that locks. You can sleep as soundly as you like." Robert's tone was matter-of-fact, but Victoria sensed the reassurance behind his words. She allowed her eyes to close, just for a moment she told herself, and immediately felt herself drifting. The last thing she was aware of was the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the solid presence of Robert Xavier beside her on the wagon bench. When Victoria woke, the sun had moved considerably across the sky and the landscape had changed. They were following a track through slightly greener terrain where water must be more accessible. She jerked upright, disoriented, and realized she had somehow ended up leaning against Robert's shoulder. She pulled away quickly, mortified. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to. That was inappropriate." Robert kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she caught the hint of amusement in his expression. "You were exhausted. No harm done. We are almost there, actually. See that stand of cottonwoods ahead? That is the ranch." Victoria looked where he indicated and saw trees in the distance. Their green leaves a startling contrast to the dun-colored landscape. As they drew closer, she made out buildings, a large barn, several smaller structures that must be the bunkhouses Robert had mentioned, corrals with horses and cattle, and set slightly apart on a small rise, a modest house with a covered porch. "That is your place there," Robert said, gesturing toward the small house. "Like I said, it needs work, but the bones are solid. My mother lived there for 6 months before she decided ranch life was not for her and moved back east to live with my sister. The wagon rolled into the ranch yard, and immediately several men emerged from the barn and bunkhouses, calling greetings to Robert and eyeing Victoria with undisguised curiosity. Robert brought the wagon to a halt near the largest bunkhouse and set the brake before jumping down. "Men, gather round," he called, and the workers assembled quickly. Victoria counted 5 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 20 to 45, all wearing the dusty, worn clothes of working cowhands. "This is Miss Victoria Ann. She is going to be keeping house and cooking for us, starting immediately. Miss Ann will be living in the small house, which is off limits to everyone except by her invitation. She is an employee of this ranch and under my protection. Anyone who makes her uncomfortable or treats her with anything less than complete respect will be looking for a new job before the sun sets. Is that understood?" The men chorused their agreement, some looking chastened by the stern tone, others nodding with what seemed like genuine appreciation. One of them, a lean man with prematurely gray hair and a weathered face, stepped forward. "Welcome, Miss Ann. I am Charlie Dawson, been working for Rob here since he started this operation. If you need anything heavy lifted or any repairs done to your house, you just let me know." "Thank you, Mr. Dawson," Victoria said, finding her voice. "I appreciate that." The other men introduced themselves in turn. There was young Billy Martinez, who could not have been more than 19 and who blushed furiously when he shook Victoria's hand. Peter Song, a Chinese man in his 30s, whose family had come to California during the gold rush, and who Robert explained was the best hand with horses he had ever seen. James Cole, a freed slave from Texas who had come west seeking opportunity and who wore a ready smile. And finally, Samuel Porter, the oldest of the crew, a former soldier who had fought for the Union and who studied Victoria with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "All right, let's get these supplies unloaded," Robert said, rolling up his sleeves. "Food goods go to Miss Ann's kitchen, ranch supplies to the barn. Let's make it quick. It will be dark soon." The men fell to work with practiced efficiency, and Victoria tried to help despite Robert's protests that she should rest. She directed where she wanted items placed in the kitchen of the small house, which was indeed dusty and cobweb-laden but structurally sound. The stove was a good one, a cast iron monster that would heat the whole house once it got going. There was a dry sink with a hand pump that, with some priming, began producing clear water from a well. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a small bedroom off to one side and a storage room that could potentially be converted to another bedroom if needed. "The privy is out back, about 30 yards, Robert said, setting down a sack of flour on the kitchen table. "Charlie can build you a closer one if you prefer, or we can rig up a bathing room in the storage area. Whatever you need." Victoria looked around the space, seeing past the dust and neglect to the potential beneath. With some cleaning and organizing, this would be a perfectly comfortable home, more comfortable, in fact, than anywhere she had lived since her parents' death. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. "Truly. I can make this work." By the time all the supplies were unloaded and put away, the sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple across the western sky. The men drifted back to their bunkhouses, tired from a long day's work. Robert lingered, helping Victoria light the lamps and showing her how to work the temperamental stove damper. "I know it is a lot to take in all at once," he said, straightening from the stove and dusting off his hands. "You do not have to start cooking tonight. The men can fend for themselves one more evening. You should rest, get settled." Victoria shook her head firmly. "No, you hired me to do a job and I will start doing it immediately. I am quite all right now, truly." The food and rest in the wagon helped considerably. If you can give me an hour, I can have a proper supper ready. Nothing elaborate tonight, but something hot and filling." Robert studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you are certain. The men usually eat around 7, gives them time to clean up after the day's work. I will send someone to help you carry the food over to the bunkhouse where we have a table set up." "What do they usually eat?" Victoria asked, already mentally inventorying the supplies in her pantry. Robert looked slightly embarrassed. "Beans, mostly. Bacon when we have it. Hardtack coffee. Sometimes someone shoots a rabbit or one of the men tries to make biscuits, though I will warn you they usually turn out hard enough to use as ammunition." Victoria felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine smile in what felt like months. "I can do better than that. Go on, tend to your work. I will manage here." After Robert left, Victoria stood in the middle of her new kitchen and took a deep breath. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, she needed to clean, at least enough to make the kitchen sanitary for cooking. She found rags among the supplies and set water to heating on the stove while she swept the worst of the dust and cobwebs away. Once the water was hot, she scrubbed down the table, the counter space, and the stovetop until they gleamed. Then she turned to the food. She had eggs, flour, butter, salt pork, dried beef, canned tomatoes, onions, and beans that had been pre-soaked by Martin's foresight. Victoria set the beans to simmering with salt pork and onions, then mixed biscuit dough and shaped it into neat rounds. She cracked eggs into a bowl and whipped them with a fork, added milk from the crock that had been kept cool in the well house, and prepared to make scrambled eggs. It would not be fancy, but it would be hot, filling, and infinitely better than what the men were used to. As she worked, Victoria felt something settle inside her, a sense of rightness that had been missing for far too long. This was familiar territory, a kitchen and food and the satisfaction of creating something nourishing from raw ingredients. Her mother had taught her that cooking with care was an act of love, a way of tending to people that went beyond mere sustenance. Victoria had always found peace in that philosophy. The biscuits went into the oven, filling the small house with the aroma of baking bread. The beans bubbled away, their smell mingling with the salt pork to create a rich, savory perfume. Victoria set the eggs aside to cook at the last minute when everything else was ready. A knock at the door startled her from her work. She wiped her hands on a rag and opened it to find young Billy Martinez standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Mr. Xavier sent me to see if you need any help carrying things, Miss Anne," Billy said, his dark eyes respectful and his voice shy. "That is very kind, Billy. Give me just a few more minutes and I will have everything ready." Victoria scrambled the eggs, pulled the golden biscuits from the oven, and began loading everything into the various pots and bowls she had found in the kitchen cupboards. Billy carried the heavy bean pot while Victoria followed with the biscuits and eggs, and a pot of fresh coffee she had brewed. The bunkhouse dining area was a large room attached to one of the bunkhouses, with a long table that could seat a dozen men and benches on either side. The crew was already gathered, looking tired and hungry. Robert sat at the head of the table and he stood when Victoria entered. "Smells like heaven," Charlie Dawson said fervently, and the other men murmured agreement. Victoria and Billy set the food on the table, and she quickly arranged everything, placing serving spoons in each dish. "Please, help yourselves. I apologize for the simple fare, but tomorrow I will have time to plan something more elaborate." The men needed no further encouragement. They dug in with enthusiasm, piling their plates high with beans, eggs, and biscuits. Victoria poured coffee for everyone, then stepped back, uncertain whether she should stay or return to her house. "Miss Anne, will you not join us?" Robert asked, gesturing to an empty spot on the bench. Victoria hesitated. "Are you certain? I do not wish to intrude." "You are part of this operation now," Robert said firmly. "You should eat with the crew." Victoria took the offered seat, and Billy passed her the biscuits with a shy smile. She served herself a modest portion, suddenly aware that she was still quite hungry despite the bread she had eaten in town. The men ate with single-minded focus for several minutes, the only sounds the clinking of forks against tin plates and appreciative grunts. Finally, Samuel Porter looked up from his plate and fixed Victoria with those sharp eyes. "Miss Anne, I have eaten in restaurants that could not produce biscuits this good. These are light as air." "My mother's recipe," Victoria said, pleased by the compliment. "The secret is not to overwork the dough." "I do not know what you did to those beans," James Cole added, "but they actually have flavor. I did not know beans could taste like anything other than beans." The other men laughed and added their own compliments. Peter Song, who had been silent until now, said something in Chinese and then translated. "My grandmother would say you have good hands for cooking. That is high praise from her." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot food. These men, rough as they might be, were sincere in their appreciation. And at the head of the table, Robert Xavier watched her with an expression she could not quite read, but that made her heart do that strange skipping thing again. After dinner, Billy and Charlie insisted on cleaning up so Victoria could rest. She returned to her small house, lit the lamps, and looked around at the space that was now hers. It still needed considerable work, but for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She changed into the nightgown she had brought in her small bag, one of the few possessions she had carried from her old life, and brushed out her long hair. The bed in the small bedroom had a decent mattress and clean linens that Robert must have arranged to have put there. When Victoria lay down, she expected to fall asleep immediately, but instead found her mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. This morning she had fainted from hunger in a general store, alone and desperate. Now she had a home, a job, food in her stomach, and something that might become a future if she worked hard and proved herself valuable. And all of it had come about because of a cowboy with gray eyes and work-worn hands who had looked at her with kindness when he could have just as easily walked away. Robert Xavier was her employer, Victoria reminded herself firmly. She would work for him, cook for him and his men, earn her wage and nothing more. It would be foolish and dangerous to allow herself to think of him as anything other than the man who had given her this opportunity. She could not afford to jeopardize this position by developing inappropriate feelings. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was the memory of his steady gaze and the gentleness of his hands as he had helped her after her collapse that followed her into dreams. The next morning, Victoria woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and men moving about the ranch yard. She dressed quickly in one of her worn work dresses, pinned up her hair, and went to the kitchen to begin breakfast. Robert had mentioned the men usually started work at first light, which meant they would need to eat early. Victoria built up the fire in the stove, set coffee to brewing, and began preparing a substantial breakfast. She made flapjacks with the last of the fresh eggs, fried up salt pork, and even managed to create a simple syrup from sugar and water to pour over the flapjacks. By the time the men began trickling into the dining hall, she had everything laid out and steaming hot. Robert was the last to arrive, his hair still damp from what must have been a quick wash at the pump. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the spread on the table, and something in his expression softened. "Miss Anne, you did not have to go to all this trouble." "It is no trouble," Victoria said, pouring him coffee. "It is my job. Over the following days, Victoria settled into a routine that was exhausting but deeply satisfying. She woke early to prepare breakfast, spent the mornings cleaning and organizing her house and planning meals, prepared a midday dinner for the men, and then used the afternoons for baking, preserving, and preparing supper. In the evenings, after the meal was served and cleaned up, she worked on mending the men's clothes, a task they were pathetically grateful for, or sewed herself new dresses from the fabric Robert had bought. The small house transformed under her care. She scrubbed every surface, organized the pantry with military precision, hung curtains she made from the printed cotton, and even planted a small herb garden in a sunny spot near the kitchen door using seeds she found in the pantry. Charlie built her a better countertop and installed shelving, and Peter Song constructed a clever rack for drying herbs and hanging pots. The men, for their part, treated her with courtesy and respect. They went out of their way to be helpful, carrying water, chopping wood, and offering to assist with any heavy work. Billy often lingered after meals to tell her about his family's ranch down in Mexico, and James taught her how to make the cornbread his mother had made in Texas, crispier and more savory than what she was used to. Samuel told stories of his war experiences, and Peter shared details about his family's market garden operation in Sacramento. But it was Robert who occupied an increasing amount of Victoria's thoughts. He was a good employer, fair and hardworking, the kind of man who would never ask his crew to do anything he would not do himself. She often saw him working alongside the men, mending fences, moving cattle, breaking horses, his shirt soaked with sweat and his face set with concentration. In the evenings, he would clean up and join the men for meals, always sitting at the head of the table, always asking Victoria about her day and whether she needed anything for the house or the kitchen. They began to have conversations that stretched beyond simple employer and employee exchanges. Robert asked about her family, and Victoria found herself telling him about her childhood on the homestead, about her father's patience and her mother's quiet strength, about the devastating winter when fever swept through and took both parents within weeks of each other. In turn, Robert shared stories of growing up in Kansas, of coming to California with his brothers to seek opportunity after the war, of slowly building his cattle operation from nothing through years of hard work and careful management. "My brothers went into other ventures," Robert explained one evening after supper. The other men had drifted away to their bunks or to play cards, but Robert had lingered to help Victoria carry dishes back to her kitchen. It had become an unofficial routine, these quiet minutes at the end of the day when they talked while she washed dishes and he dried. Marcus is a freight operator in San Francisco now, quite successful. Daniel became a lawman in Sacramento. Thomas married a rancher's daughter and manages her father's property up near the Oregon border. They all thought I was crazy to stake a claim in the middle of the desert. "But you have made it work," Victoria said, handing him a clean plate. "From what I can see, the operation is thriving." "It is doing well," Robert agreed, drying the plate with careful attention. "Better than I hoped when I started 5 years ago. The mines need constant supplies of beef, and I have contracts with 3 different operations now. I could expand further if I wanted, take on more men, run more cattle." "But you do not want to?" Victoria asked, hearing the hesitation in his voice. Robert was quiet for a moment, staring down at the plate in his hands. "I want to build something lasting, not just profitable. I have seen too many men chase wealth at the expense of everything else, working themselves to death, or becoming so consumed with business that they forget how to live. My father was like that, always chasing the next opportunity, never satisfied with what he had. It killed him in the end, the stress and the constant pushing. I want something different, Victoria understood that desire in her bones. My parents were happy with their small homestead. They never got rich, but they had each other and their family and work they believed in. That seemed like enough. It should be enough, Robert said quietly, and when he looked at her, something in his eyes made Victoria's breath catch. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, until Victoria forced herself to look away and plunge her hands back into the dishwater. Well, your operation is certainly providing good work for the men and for me. I am grateful for that. Victoria, Robert said, and the use of her first name without the formal Miss Anne made her look back up at him. I want you to know that you have exceeded every expectation I had. The men are happier, better fed, and more productive. The ranch runs smoother. You have made a real difference here. Thank you, Victoria managed, her cheeks warming under his direct gaze. I am trying my best. I can see that, and I appreciate it more than I can say. After Robert left that night, Victoria stood in her kitchen for a long time, her hands pressed against the cool countertop, trying to calm the racing of her heart. She was developing feelings for her employer, deep feelings that went far beyond gratitude or professional respect. She looked forward to seeing him every day, found herself listening for his voice in the yard, felt a warm glow when he complimented her cooking or smiled at something she said. It was dangerous and foolish, and she did not know how to stop it. The weeks passed in a blur of activity. Summer's heat intensified, making the kitchen work almost unbearable in the afternoons. So Victoria adjusted her schedule to do the heaviest cooking in the early morning and late evening. She learned to prepare meals that would keep in the heat, to use the limited ingredients available in creative ways, to stretch the budget Robert gave her for supplies while still providing nutritious and appealing food. She also learned the rhythms of ranch life, the seasonal patterns of cattle work, the challenges of maintaining equipment and structures in the harsh climate, the constant vigilance required to protect livestock from predators and theft. The men included her in their conversations over meals, explaining what they were working on and asking her opinion on various matters. She felt herself becoming part of the community rather than just an employee on its periphery. One afternoon in late September, Victoria was in her garden harvesting the herbs that had surprisingly thrived in the dry climate when she heard a commotion from the direction of the main barn. Raised voices, the sound of agitated horses, and then Robert's voice rising above the others in sharp command. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw several men gathered near the corral. Billy came running toward her house, his young face creased with worry. "Miss Anne, we need clean cloth and hot water if you have it. There has been an accident." Victoria's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What happened?" One of the horses spooked while Peter was working with it. "Mr. Xavier got thrown into the fence. He is cut up pretty bad." Victoria was already moving toward her kitchen. "Get Charlie to build up my stove fire and put the big pot on to boil. I will gather medical supplies." She had a basic medical kit that she had assembled from the general store supplies, items she had requested on previous trips into Skidoo. Her mother had served as the community healer on their homestead, and Victoria had learned enough to handle common injuries. She grabbed the kit, clean towels, and her bottle of whiskey that she kept for medicinal purposes, and hurried toward the barn. The men had Robert laid out on a clear patch of ground, and even from a distance, Victoria could see the blood. She swallowed hard against the surge of fear and forced herself to think clinically. Billy ran ahead to prepare the hot water as instructed, and Victoria knelt beside Robert. "Let me see," she said firmly, gently pushing aside Charlie's hands where he had been trying to staunch the bleeding with his own bandana. Robert's face was pale beneath his tan, and a long gash ran from his temple down to his jaw, bleeding heavily as head wounds did. His shirt was torn, revealing scrapes and cuts along his ribs, and one arm hung at an odd angle that worried her. "Robert, can you hear me?" she asked, leaning close to his face. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then locking on hers. "Victoria, I am all right." "You are very much not all right, but we are going to fix you up." She looked at the gathered men. "Samuel, that arm might be broken or dislocated. Can you tell?" Samuel had the most medical experience from his army days. Samuel carefully examined Robert's arm, his weathered face serious. "Dislocated shoulder, I think. I have seen enough of them. I can reset it, but it will hurt like hell." "Do what you need to do," Robert said through gritted teeth. Victoria focused on the head wound, using clean water to carefully wash away the blood so she could see the extent of the damage. It was long but not deep, and appeared to have missed anything vital. Head wounds bled dramatically, but this one would heal. She cleaned it thoroughly, applied pressure to stop the bleeding, and then used her needle and thread to stitch it closed with small, neat sutures her mother had taught her. Robert bore it stoically, only flinching when Samuel reset his shoulder with a sickening pop that made Victoria's stomach turn. The ribs were scraped but not broken, and the other cuts were minor. By the time she finished cleaning and bandaging everything, Robert looked like he had been through a war, but the bleeding had stopped and the immediate danger was past. "You need to rest," Victoria said firmly. "No arguments. Charlie, can you and James help get him to his quarters?" "I can walk," Robert protested, but when he tried to sit up, he went pale and swayed dangerously. "You can accept help or I will knock you over the head and drag you there myself," Victoria said sharply, surprising herself with her own vehemence. The fear she had been holding at bay was transforming into anger now that she knew he would be all right. "You could have been killed." Robert looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise or appreciation. "Yes, madam." The men half-carried Robert to his quarters, a small cabin near the main barn that Victoria had never entered. She followed, carrying her medical kit, and supervised as they settled him on his bed. The cabin was sparse but clean, containing a bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a lamp, and little else. "Everyone out," Victoria said. "I need to check him over once more now that he is lying flat, make sure we did not miss anything." The men filed out, leaving Victoria alone with Robert. She conducted a thorough examination, checking his pupils for signs of concussion, his breathing for indication of rib damage, his extremities for breaks or serious sprains. Everything seemed stable, though he would be sore and bruised for weeks. "You scared me," Victoria said quietly, not looking at him as she repacked her medical kit. "I scared myself," Robert admitted. "That horse has never spooked before. Something must have set him off. Could have been a snake. You need to be more careful. These men depend on you." "The ranch depends on you." "I depend on you," she did not say, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. "Victoria, look at me." She raised her eyes to his face, taking in the white bandage that now covered the left side of his head, the pallor of his skin, the tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain he was trying to hide. "Thank you," Robert said. "You were calm and capable when it mattered." "I am grateful you were here. It is part of taking care of the household," Victoria said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Which includes stubborn employers who take foolish risks." The corner of Robert's mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. "Noted. I will try to be less stubborn and foolish. See that you do." Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt. "I am going to prepare a light supper for you, broth and bread. You should eat something even if you do not feel like it. And I will check on you later tonight to make sure you are not running a fever." She left before Robert could protest. her hands shaking slightly now that the crisis was over. In her kitchen, she gripped the edge of the counter and took several deep breaths. The fear that had gripped her when she saw Robert lying on the ground had been overwhelming, far beyond what an employee should feel for an employer. She could no longer deny what was becoming obvious. She was falling in love with Robert Xavier. That evening, Victoria prepared simple meals for the crew and took a tray to Robert's cabin. She knocked softly and entered when he called for her to come in. He had managed to wash up and change into clean clothes, though the effort had clearly cost him. He was propped up against the headboard of his bed, looking exhausted. Victoria set the tray across his lap and watched to make sure he ate at least some of the broth and bread. "How is the pain?" she asked. "Manageable," Robert grimaced, "though I would not want to try riding a horse tomorrow." "You will not be riding a horse for at least a week," Victoria said firmly. "You have a concussion, stitches, a recently dislocated shoulder, and heaven knows what other injuries. You need rest." "I cannot afford to rest. There is too much work to be done." "The men can handle things for a few days. You have good workers who know what they are doing, and I will check in with them, make sure everything is running smoothly." Robert studied her for a long moment. "When did you become so bossy?" "When my employer decided to argue with a horse and lost." Victoria took the tray as he finished eating. "I will come back before bed to check on you. If you need anything before then, send one of the men to fetch me." Over the next few days, Victoria split her time between her regular duties and checking on Robert's recovery. She changed his bandages, monitored his healing, and brought him meals in his cabin since he was not supposed to be up and moving around much. They spent long hours talking, conversations that ranged from practical ranch matters to deeper discussions about dreams and fears and the paths that had brought them both to this place. "I never thought I would run a cattle ranch in the middle of the desert," Robert admitted one afternoon. Victoria was changing the dressing on his head wound, which was healing cleanly thanks to her careful stitching. "I studied engineering before the war, had plans to build bridges and railways." "What changed?" Victoria asked, her fingers gentle as she worked. "The war changed everything. By the time it was over, I just wanted space and silence. The West offered that, and I found I was good at ranching, good at working with animals and land. It was honest work that made sense when nothing else did." Victoria secured the new bandage and sat back. "I understand that. After my parents died, I just wanted to keep moving, to not think too much about what I had lost. Coming here, starting fresh, it felt like a way to breathe again." "Do you miss your old life?" The question hung between them. Victoria considered it carefully. "I miss my parents terribly. I miss the security of knowing where I belonged. But the person I was becoming there, sad and defeated and just surviving, I do not miss her. Here, I feel like I have purpose again." Robert caught her hand before she could rise, his fingers warm around hers. "You have done more than find purpose. You have created something here, made this place feel like a home instead of just a work camp. The men feel it, I feel it." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. "Robert, I do not think we should." "Should not what? Tell the truth." His gray eyes held hers, intent and serious. "Victoria, I know this is complicated. You work for me, you depend on me for your livelihood, and I have tried to respect that boundary. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel. You are not just my employee. You have become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with cooking or housekeeping." "What are you saying?" Victoria whispered, afraid to hear the answer and desperate for it at the same time. "I am saying that I have come to care for you deeply, that I think about you constantly, that seeing you every day has become the best part of my life." Robert's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I am saying that if you felt anything similar, I would like to court you properly, with your permission, Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, emotion welling up from somewhere deep inside. "I've tried not to feel anything. You gave me this opportunity when I had nothing. I did not want to repay your kindness by developing inappropriate feelings. There is nothing inappropriate about honest emotion between two people." Robert sat up further, wincing slightly at the movement but not releasing her hand. "Victoria, I would never pressure you or make your position here dependent on your feelings toward me. If you do not feel the same way, nothing changes. You still have a home here, a job, security. But if there is any chance you might care for me, even a fraction of what I feel for you, I want to explore that." Victoria looked down at their joined hands, his so large and work-worn, her smaller but equally marked by labor. She thought about the past months, the gradual way her heart had opened despite her best efforts to keep it closed. She thought about the way Robert had treated her from the beginning, with respect and kindness, and a fundamental decency that had nothing to do with wanting anything from her. She thought about the terror she had felt seeing him injured, and the peace she found in their evening conversations. "I care for you," she said softly, raising her eyes to meet his. "I have tried not to, but I do, very much." The smile that broke across Robert's face was like sunrise, brilliant and warming. "Then may I court you, Victoria Ann, properly and honorably?" "Yes," Victoria said, and felt something that had been knotted tight inside her chest finally loosen and unfurl. "Yes, you may." Robert lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. The gesture was simple but carried such tenderness that Victoria felt her breath catch. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined, the future suddenly bright with possibility. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Victoria had imagined. Robert was a methodical man who approached courting with the same focused attention he applied to ranching. Despite his injuries, which kept him from heavy work for another week, he found ways to spend time with Victoria that went beyond their employer-employee relationship. He brought her wildflowers he had one of the men gather from the hills, arranged in a tin cup because the ranch had no vases. He sat with her in the evenings on the porch of her small house, both of them watching the spectacular sunsets that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. He asked her questions about her dreams and her past, listening with genuine interest to her answers. And he told her about himself, slowly revealing the layers of the man beneath the capable rancher exterior. Victoria learned that Robert read voraciously, borrowing books from the small library in Skidoo and treasuring each one like gold. She learned he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, making observations that caught her off guard and made her laugh. She learned he was scrupulously honest in all his dealings, to the point where some people thought him overly rigid, but that he would also quietly help someone in need without expecting recognition or repayment. The ranch crew, far from being awkward about the developing relationship, seemed genuinely pleased. Charlie clapped Robert on the shoulder and declared he had been hoping something like this would happen. Billy teased them gently and offered to chaperone if they wanted to go riding together. Samuel made a comment about it being high time Robert settled down, and James baked a special cornbread to celebrate, using a family recipe he claimed was only made for happy occasions. In mid-October, Robert announced he needed to make a trip to Skidoo and invited Victoria to accompany him. "We can make a day of it," he suggested. "Do the supplies shopping, maybe have lunch at the restaurant, take our time heading back." Victoria agreed eagerly, excited at the prospect of time away from the ranch with Robert. They set out early on a crisp autumn morning, the air finally cooling from the summer's brutal heat. Victoria wore one of the new dresses she had made, a deep blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and Robert had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well, wearing clean clothes and a vest she had not seen before. The ride to Skidoo was pleasant, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. When they arrived in town, Robert helped Victoria down from the wagon with his hands on her waist, and she was suddenly very aware of how natural it felt to have him touch her, to stand close to him in the dusty street. They conducted their business at the general store first. Martin greeted them warmly and made a few sly comments about how well Victoria looked compared to the last time he had seen her, which made her blush and Robert shoot him a warning look that held no real anger. They loaded supplies into the wagon, then Robert surprised her by guiding her not to the restaurant, but to a small jeweler's shop she had not noticed on previous visits. "Robert, what are we doing here?" Victoria asked as he opened the door for her. "I want to buy you something," he said simply. "If you will allow it." Inside the shop, glass cases displayed an array of jewelry, far more than Victoria would have expected in a rough mining town. The jeweler, a neat man with careful hands and eyeglasses perched on his nose, greeted them pleasantly. "I am looking for something special," Robert said. "Something that would suit a hard-working woman who deserves to have beautiful things." The jeweler studied Victoria for a moment, then pulled a velvet tray from beneath the counter. On it lay several pieces, and he selected a delicate silver chain with a small pendant in the shape of a bird with tiny blue stones for eyes. "This is turquoise from the local mines," the jeweler explained. "The bird represents freedom and hope." "The piece was made by a Paiute craftsman who occasionally sells to me. It is unique." Victoria stared at the necklace, moved by its simple beauty. "Robert, it is too much. Let me decide what is too much." Robert picked up the necklace and, with the jeweler's permission, moved behind Victoria to fasten it around her neck. His fingers were gentle on her skin, and Victoria closed her eyes briefly at the intimacy of the gesture. The pendant settled just above her collarbone, cool against her skin. Robert paid for the necklace over Victoria's protests, and they left the shop with her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. They had lunch at the restaurant, a luxury Victoria had not experienced in longer than she could remember, and Robert told her stories about his brothers that had her laughing until her sides hurt. On the ride back to the ranch, Victoria found herself leaning against Robert's shoulder, his arm around her to steady her as the wagon bounced over the rough road. The pendant hung around her neck, a tangible reminder of his feelings, and she felt happier than she had been in years. As autumn deepened into winter, the courtship continued. Robert was respectful of Victoria's reputation, never pushing for more than was proper, but making his intentions clear. In late November, as they sat on her porch watching an early snow dust the distant mountains, he asked her formally if she would marry him. Victoria did not hesitate. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in early December in the small church in Skidoo, with the ranch crew serving as witnesses, and much of the town turning out to celebrate. Victoria wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had sewn herself, trimmed with lace she had splurged on from Martin's store. Robert wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his face showing signs of the nervousness he claimed not to feel. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. The traveling preacher spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of partnership. And when Robert slipped a gold band onto Victoria's finger and promised to love and honor her for all his days, she believed him with every fiber of her being. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the barn and food prepared by the crew with varying levels of success. Charlie attempted a speech that turned into rambling anecdotes about Robert's early ranching disasters, making everyone laugh. Billy played guitar and sang songs in Spanish that brought tears to Victoria's eyes, even though she understood only some of the words. The whole town seemed to celebrate with them, and Victoria marveled at how far she had come from the desperate woman who had fainted from hunger in the general store only months before. That night, in Robert's cabin that was now their cabin, he held her gently and kissed her with a passion that had been carefully restrained throughout their courtship. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "From the moment I saw you fall, I felt something shift inside me. I did not know what it was then, but I know now. You are my heart, Victoria." "And you are mine," Victoria replied, her arms around him, her heart full to bursting. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved." Their life together settled into a pattern that was both familiar and new. Victoria continued to cook and manage the household, but now she did so as the ranch owner's wife rather than an employee. Robert consulted her on business decisions, valuing her practical mind and good judgment. Together, they expanded the operation, adding more cattle and eventually purchasing adjoining land to increase their grazing territory. The small house where Victoria had first lived became a guest cottage, and they made improvements to Robert's cabin, expanding it into a proper home with multiple rooms and modern conveniences. Victoria insisted on keeping a vegetable garden, which flourished under her care and provided fresh produce for the household. She also began teaching reading and writing to some of the men who had never had the opportunity to learn, holding informal lessons in the evenings that Robert often joined. In the spring of 1880, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. Robert was beside himself with joy and worry, suddenly treating her like she was made of glass. Victoria, exasperated by his hovering, finally had to sit him down and explain that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities with some reasonable modifications. Their son was born in late summer, a healthy baby boy they named Matthew after Robert's father. Robert held his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face, overcome with emotion in a way Victoria had never seen. "He is perfect," Robert kept saying. "You are amazing. I cannot believe we made this." Victoria, exhausted and sore but happier than she had ever been, watched her husband cradle their child and felt her heart expand to encompass this new person they had created together. Matthew was a good baby, easy-tempered and healthy, and the ranch crew doted on him shamelessly. Uncle Charlie carved him toys from wood. Uncle Billy sang him songs in Spanish. Uncle Samuel told him stories from his army days, even though Matthew was far too young to understand. And Uncle Peter taught him Chinese words that became some of his first attempts at speech. 2 years later, Victoria gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Robert's mother. Sarah was fierce from the beginning, entering the world with a lusty cry and an apparent determination to be heard. She was followed 3 years later by another son, Daniel, who was quiet and thoughtful, content to observe the world around him with serious eyes. The ranch continued to prosper. Robert proved to have an exceptional head for business, and Victoria's careful management of household finances meant they were able to save and reinvest in the operation. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market fluctuations and labor challenges, but always together, always supporting each other. In 1887, they made the decision to build a new house, a proper ranch house with bedrooms for each child, a large kitchen where Victoria could work comfortably, a study for Robert's business affairs, and a living room big enough to host community gatherings. It was built from local stone and timber, designed to withstand the desert climate while providing comfort for the growing family. The ranch crew changed over the years as men moved on to other opportunities or retired, but some stayed. Charlie remained until his death at age 67, having become like family. Billy eventually married a woman from town and started his own small ranch nearby, though he still helped out when needed. Samuel lived on the ranch until he passed peacefully in his sleep at 72. Peter Song brought his extended family to work on the ranch, and the Songs became integral to the operation for generations. Victoria's life was full and rich in ways she never could have imagined during those desperate days before arriving in Skidoo. She raised her children with the same love and practical wisdom her own parents had shown her. She taught Sarah to be independent and strong while still maintaining compassion. She showed Matthew and Daniel how to be men of integrity and kindness like their father. She maintained her position as the emotional and practical heart of the ranch community, cooking for crews during busy seasons, nursing sick workers, mediating disputes, and providing a listening ear to anyone who needed one. Robert grew into his role as patriarch with grace, respected throughout the region as a fair businessman and a good neighbor. He served on the town council in Skidoo, helping to build schools and improve infrastructure. He was known for giving young men their start, for treating workers with dignity, for keeping his word no matter the cost. But at home with Victoria, he remained the same man who had once filled her arms with supplies when she had nothing, who had offered her a chance without asking anything in return, who had courted her with wildflowers and patience. Their love deepened over the years, weathering the challenges that life inevitably brought. There were hard times, certainly, seasons when money was tight or illness struck or grief visited their door. They lost a fourth child, a daughter born too early who lived only a few hours, and the shared grief of that loss brought them even closer together. They supported each other through the deaths of parents and siblings, through the fears that came with raising children in an unforgiving land, through the doubts and worries that afflicted even the strongest people. But there were far more moments of joy than sorrow. The first time Matthew successfully broke a horse, with Robert coaching him patiently and Victoria watching with her heart in her throat. The pride on Sarah's face when she graduated from the new school in Skidoo at the top of her class, already making plans to become a teacher herself. Daniel's quiet satisfaction when he bred 2 horses and produced a foal that went on to win prizes at regional shows. The ranch dances they hosted, with music and laughter filling the air late into the night. The quiet evenings on their porch, Victoria and Robert sitting side by side, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. As the 19th century drew to a close, Victoria and Robert found themselves grandparents. Matthew married a doctor's daughter from Sacramento and gave them 2 grandsons and a granddaughter. Sarah, true to her fierce nature, became a teacher and married another teacher, a man who respected her intelligence and independence. They had 1 daughter who showed every sign of inheriting her mother's determination. Daniel married late, at 32, to a widow with 2 children of her own, and together they had a son who became the apple of his grandfather's eye. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Robert surprised Victoria with a trip to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their honeymoon. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the opera, walked along the waterfront, and generally played at being city people for a week. But both admitted they were relieved to return to the ranch, to the wide skies and the familiar rhythms of home. "I could not have imagined this life," Victoria said one evening as they sat on their porch, now weathered by years of sun and wind but still solid. Their children were grown and gone to their own homes, the house quiet around them. "When I walked into that general store in Skidoo," Half dead from hunger and completely alone, I thought my life was essentially over. I could not see a future. Robert, now 52 and showing silver in his dark hair, took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "That was the luckiest day of my life, the day you fainted in Martin's store. I know that sounds terrible, but it is true. If you had not been desperate, if I had not been there at exactly that moment, we might never have found each other." "I think we would have found each other eventually," Victoria said with the certainty that came from decades of love. "Some things are meant to be. Do you ever regret it?" "The hardship, the isolation, the years of difficult work." Victoria turned to look at her husband, this man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and had spent 20 years proving that first impression correct every single day. "Not for a single moment. This life, our family, this ranch, it is more than I ever dared hope for. You gave me everything, Robert." "No," Robert said softly. "We gave each other everything. That is what partnership means." They sat together as the sun set, two people who had found each other against unlikely odds and built something lasting. The ranch spread around them, testament to their hard work and shared vision. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the current crew finishing the day's work, cattle lowing in the corrals, horses nickering in the barn. It was the soundtrack of the life they had created, and it was sweeter than any symphony. Years continued to pass. Victoria and Robert aged together, their bodies showing the inevitable wear of hard-lived lives, but their minds remained sharp and their love undiminished. They handed over more and more of the daily ranch operations to Matthew and Daniel, who had both returned to help manage the expanding business, but they remained the emotional center of the family. On a clear morning in October of 1905, 27 years after they first met in that general store, Victoria woke before dawn as was her lifelong habit. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to Robert's steady breathing beside her, feeling grateful for another day together. They were both in their 70s now, slowed by arthritis and the accumulation of minor ailments, but still present and engaged with life. She rose carefully, not wanting to wake Robert, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The house was quiet, filled with memories of the life they had built. Photographs of children and grandchildren covered the mantel. Furniture they had chosen together filled the rooms. Her herb garden, now tended by a granddaughter who had inherited her love of growing things, flourished outside the window. Robert found her there an hour later, standing at the window with a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the sun rise over the Panamint Mountains. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Good morning, my love," he murmured. "Good morning," Victoria replied, leaning back against him. "I was just thinking about how beautiful it is here. I never get tired of these sunrises." "Neither do I, though the view improved considerably when you became part of it." Victoria laughed and turned in his arms to face him. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his gray eyes still held the same kindness and intelligence that had first drawn her to him. "You are a shameless flatterer. I am an honest man stating facts." Robert kissed her forehead gently. "What shall we do with this beautiful day?" "I thought we might visit Sarah. She mentioned the baby was cutting teeth and not sleeping well. Perhaps we could give her and Thomas a few hours to rest." "Excellent idea. And afterward, we could ride out to the north pasture. I want to see how the new water system Daniel installed is working." It was an ordinary day, filled with the small tasks and simple pleasures that made up their life together. They visited their daughter and played with their fussy grandchild until the baby finally settled down for a nap. They rode out to check on ranch business, moving more slowly than they once had but still capable and engaged. They had dinner with Matthew's family, enjoying the chaos of grandchildren and laughter. They returned home as the sun set, tired but content. That evening, sitting together on their beloved porch as they had done thousands of times before, Victoria rested her head on Robert's shoulder and said, "I have been thinking about writing down our story. For the grandchildren, so they know where they came from." "That is a wonderful idea," Robert said, his arm around her shoulders. "Though you will have to do the actual writing. My penmanship has always been terrible. I will write it and you can check it for accuracy." Victoria smiled. "Should I start with the part where I dramatically fainted in the general store?" "Definitely start there. It is where everything began." Robert was quiet for a moment, then added, "Make sure you tell them how brave you were, walking 40 miles alone, determined to make a new life. How you faced your fear and kept going even when everything seemed hopeless. That is important for them to know. I will tell them about a cowboy who saw someone in need and helped without asking for anything in return, who treated a desperate stranger with kindness and respect, who turned out to be the best man I ever knew. Now who is the shameless flatterer?" Robert teased, but his voice was thick with emotion. They sat together as full darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast sky above. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and desert flowers. From somewhere in the distance came the cry of a coyote, wild and lonesome. But here on this porch, in each other's arms, Victoria and Robert felt only peace. Victoria did write their story, filling page after page with memories and reflections, wanting to preserve for future generations the unlikely love story that had started with a fainting spell in a general store and grown into a lifetime of partnership and devotion. She wrote about the hardships and the triumphs, the sorrows and the joys, but mostly she wrote about love, the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of choosing each other every day for nearly 3 decades. Robert Xavier and Victoria Ann lived out their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by family and sustained by the love that had defined their lives. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the property, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names, and a single word that summed up everything they had been to each other: beloved. The ranch continued through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But they all knew where it had started, with a cowboy who filled a hungry woman's arms with supplies, and in doing so, discovered the great love of his life. It became family legend, the story told and retold, of how one act of kindness in a dusty general store in Skidoo, California, in the year 1878, had changed everything. And every telling ended the same way, with the reminder that Victoria and Robert wanted passed down through the generations. That love could be found in the most unlikely circumstances, that kindness was never wasted, that two people who chose each other and worked together could build something that would last far beyond their own lives. Their story was proof that even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Old West, hearts could find each other and create something beautiful that would endure.